Perhaps we could take our seats so that we can convene the meeting more or less on time. Boy, that's the fastest response I've gotten to that kind of request in a long time. Hey, Congressman, how are you? Andy? Remarkably orderly crowd. I'm Bill Galston, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and the co-director, along with Bill Crystal, from whom you'll hear in just a minute, of the new center. And I'd like to take this occasion to welcome all of you to the first, but I suspect not the last, New Center Ideas Summit. We have a great program, and Bill and I are going to say our piece very briefly and get out of the way as quickly as possible. But first, I thought I and then Bill Crystal would tell you a little bit about how this came to be and why we think it's necessary and where it stands. I'll tell you a story that goes back almost a quarter of a century. I was a senior official in Bill Clinton's White House, 1993. And I remember not too long after I first walked in the door, reading Bill Crystal's famous memo on why it was that the Clinton health care plan needed to be strangled in its cradle, which it was, by the way, very effective. And I gnashed my teeth, and Bill and I have been sparring partners for about a quarter of a century. Then a funny thing happened last November. We were in the middle of the 14th round of our match, and this guy parachuted in from WWE and knocked our heads together. And when we came to, we discovered that we were sitting on two stools in the same corner. And so the idea grew on us of exploring the possibility that despite our long sparring match, that we actually, in these new circumstances, agreed on more than we disagreed, and that what we agreed on was much more important than what we disagreed on. So we sat down and wrote an op-ed, which was very easy. It was so easy that we said, well, why don't we see if we can drill down a little bit deeper on the issues front. And so we got a little push and some support from No Labels, and then we ultimately became an independent 501c3 project. What you have before you today is the first draft of the first tranche of ideas from the new center. They all, broadly speaking, cohere around the economy and ways of improving both growth and participation of everybody who wants to work in the economy. They are meant to start a discussion, not to end one, which is why we are so pleased that there's so much time today for actual discussion of these ideas. We don't expect instant assent, but we do hope for engagement. Finally, why do we think this is important, and why do we hope you think it's important as well? Answer, I think it should be clear to everybody that the stale, polarized debate, which is now almost 30 years old, which was at one time productive of useful controversy and progress for the country, in which both political parties participated, has now become an obstacle to our future. And we think it is time to focus on the possibility that there is more latent agreement in the broad center of American politics and the American people, both in the United States and, as you'll hear in just a few minutes, in the UK and many other places besides. In France, of course, a courageous young leader has already acted on the proposition that there is, under the surface of old political competition, all sorts of new agreement bubbling. Could that be true in the United States? Could it be true in the UK? We'll spend this afternoon exploring that possibility, but now let me turn the podium over to my partner in crime, Bill Crystal.
Thanks, Bill. I think Bill's story about his being in the Clinton White House and me sending these memos does date us a little bit, particularly because these memos were used the most advanced technology possible. This was one of the gimmicks that got them some attention. We faxed them out to thousands of people. I was like, wow, the fax machine, cutting edge technology. So I suppose I will use that, though, to say, I just want to make a couple of quick points. I mean, I'm happy to be part of this. Bill really has been involved with No Labels and with other efforts to do centrist public policy for quite a while. I've been a pretty cheerful partisan during most of this time and didn't see much reason to worry too much about the state, at least of the party that I've been affiliated with since I came to Washington. I was perfectly happy to vote for John McCain and Mitt Romney and think that they would do a pretty good job as president. But things obviously have changed. I do think it's a new moment. I don't think it's particularly useful to be too nostalgic about the good old days. That's why, the fax machine and alleged bipartisan cooperation, there was more of it then, obviously, in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, maybe peaking in the mid-late 90s. But, we're not going to recreate a world of 20 years ago. So when Bill and I agreed to do this, we both have very much had the attitude of let's take a look and see whether it is possible to just, in a few areas, to see is there a centrist agenda that's A, centrist, could actually conceivably get a fair amount of support, B, and most importantly, I should have said this is A, I guess, substantively sound, would actually address the problems the country's facing, but C, not nostalgic, not just splitting the difference, not just hand-wringing about the Tea Party on the one hand and Bernie Sanders on the other, but a real attempt to look at the issues in a fresh way. And I think when we look at, and these ideas in the booklet need to be developed much more, and some of them will probably turn out to need to be modified quite a bit. But for me, at least, I was open-minded or agnostic going in as to whether this was sort of a plausible project, I would say, honestly. And for me, I do think what I've learned is that it is. As a kind of proof of concept, there's enough there that neither party is doing that can be done to address real problems in a serious, substantive way, A, and B, there's at least the chance of getting serious political support, I think, for such efforts in the not-too-distant future, maybe not right away, though it's such a fluid political environment, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks. I think if you had predicted 3 months ago or 1 month ago, Charlottesville was 1 month ago, President Trump, in my opinion, correctly, was denounced quite correctly for what he said and did and didn't say. People resigned from advisory boards in the Trump Commission, again, I think quite correctly, didn't want to be associated with it. 1 month later, the president's yucking it up with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. I guess Chuck Schumer's going to be here tomorrow morning. He'll object to that characterization in the Oval Office, and they're apparently, we'll see, cutting a deal on something that one would have, not the first issue one would have thought that Donald Trump might cut a deal on. Leaving aside entirely the merits of this and whether it's going to really happen and who should get credit or blame, what it shows, I think, is just how volatile and fluid the situation is. And I think it's a mistake to therefore look at the last few years or the last few months and say, oh, the possibility of serious bipartisanship or nonpartisanship is the possibility isn't there. We really don't know. I think it's and certainly younger members of Congress I've spoken to in both parties are very interested, I think, in moving forward in some of these areas. Maybe we're not going to fix the entire healthcare system or the entire tax code at one time, but can't we do something about some of these particular areas that we discuss in that little booklet, but also many others, incidentally. One of the biggest aspects of dysfunction, I think, of the system now is that one has the sense that if Congress can't fix the biggest things, it doesn't do anything, which is a little crazy. I mean, if one lived one's life that way, that would be a very big mistake, I think. And I do think lots of people got elected to the House and the Senate, and they don't think they're there simply to either rubber stamp something that leadership gives them 3 hours before the vote, or to protest something leadership gives them 3 hours before the vote. They'd actually like to legislate and do some good for the country in one or another of these areas. So I think that pendulum may be swinging. Anyway, we don't know. All we can do is try to put out some ideas and see if people respond to them. So I think this is, and I would say personally, again, in the 4 or 5 months we've been doing this, I'm much more hopeful now than I think I would have been 4 or 5 months ago as to that some of these ideas might have a friendlier and more imminent reception than I originally thought. This is sort of a 2020 project, maybe even after that. The next 2-3 years are just going to be hopeless to get anything done. I really don't quite buy that anymore. And I don't know how it's going to happen and what kinds of different coalitions one can imagine. But I do think it's a more interesting moment than one might have thought. And so I'm very happy that we were able to do this modest piece of work and put it out there, and then we'll continue to do move along this path. But the most important thing is that everyone else move along this path, because lots of other people, this is more, as I say, of a proof of concept and a spur to others to move ahead, I think, than some document that's terribly important in its own right. Anyway, that's my sort of perspective on what we've tried to do. And now I will get off the stage, and I guess we'll reappear a little bit later, but I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Parker, who will moderate a discussion, a very interesting discussion between two political leaders whom I have admired for a very long time, Tony Blair and Joe Lieberman.
To get on my stool, I think. Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Well, I brought a scarf, which I'll keep strategically placed. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm always happy to be surrounded by centrist-minded folks, otherwise known as sane people, my favorite kind. And I'm delighted to have these two gentlemen to chat with. So we've been talking backstage a little about this new center movement. And I'd like to direct this question to both of you, and just tell us a little bit about how you expect to create a new center. And both the UK and the United States share some of the same problems, the hyperpartisanship and this big gap between that we seem unable to bridge. But the new center would seem appropriately timed, but the question is, how do you get people to sign on? So we'll start with Mr. Blair, please.
I think you have to start from the question, what is the political space that you're trying to occupy? And what I've noticed both sides of the Atlantic is that over the past years, the politics has become very polarized. There's really not a great sense of people coming together in search of what I would call solutions-oriented politics. And, if you're looking at the UK right now, you'd have to say there are millions of what I've called politically homeless people. I mean, people who are anxious about the direction of the Labour Party, which has gone very far to the left. And if they don't support Brexit, then it's quite hard to support the Conservative Party. So you're in a situation where you have that space there in the middle. Now, I don't think it can be occupied unless we're very clear from our politics. What's happened and why it's happened. Because, I sort of grew up in politics pretty much thinking I understood it. And then when I won 3 elections and became Prime Minister for 10 years, I really did think I did understand it. Or at least I understood it quite well. Over these last years, I've become a student of politics again, because I think you have to, I didn't predict some of the upheavals, and so you've got to analyze why is that happening. And I think it's partly objective reasons, post-financial crisis, post-9/11, uncertainty as to whether those in power have got the answers. And then I think it's partly subjective. I think the center ground got a bit mushy. It wasn't putting forward strong solutions. It seemed sometimes as if it was kind of splitting the difference, which is never what the center's been about for me. And then I think you've got, the revolutionary implications of social media, which I think is a revolutionary phenomenon all in itself. I mean, I really don't think you can analyze today's politics without understanding the importance of these great surges of emotion driven by social media, which are disorienting, but which also offer the opportunity for people to come in on the back of them and surf that wave. So I think, for all of those reasons, objective and subjective, politics has been undergoing this enormous process of change, but the space is still there. The question is still being asked, how do I get representation for politics that is going to offer solutions of change that actually work? And, it's our job to find the energy and the determination and the wisdom, the intelligence and the policy to be able to fill that space. But I'm quite sure it can be done. And by the way, if it's not done, I think we're in for a very difficult time indeed, because otherwise the politics gets more and more polarized until you get two groups of people who don't speak to each other, who actually somewhat detest each other. And, in our politics, that can be very dangerous because it can lead to a kind of winner-takes-all mentality where the purpose is just to win. And then once you've won, you then want to sweep away the other side. And on the other side, they just want to wait until they can pull you down and get themselves in power. Now that's, this is basically happening, I think it's in the US, but certainly in the UK. It's all over Europe as well. So this is a global phenomenon. And, the opportunity, I think, is there. And the reason I feel so passionately about it is that I really do think the consequences of us not mobilizing that center are going to be grim indeed.
Well, just to interject something here, I hate to think about a philosophical approach to problem solving as a marketing challenge. But in a sense, it is in this country. Senator Lieberman, we have a culture of that's sort of entrenched, and it has to do with winners and losers and highly competitive, left versus right. I mean, it's a template that's part of our daily culture. How do you undo that? And do you think it's even possible given the media environment that Mr. Blair described?
Well, first let me, as the co-chair of No Labels, the only co-chair, because my co-chair went off and was going to be ambassador in Moscow. I would have preferred to stay here and be co-chair of No Labels. But anyway, let me welcome everybody and say how grateful we are that Prime Minister Blair is here, and Kathleen, thank you. And in a sense, to welcome our newest offspring of the No Labels family, which is the newscenter.org, which we're very optimistic about. So on this question of, first of it, on the question of understanding politics, I thought back to something I was told way back when I was a state senator in Connecticut. We were in the midst of a very confusing political situation. One of my senior colleagues said to me, I was expressing my wonderment at it. He said, if you're not confused, you don't understand the situation. So there you go. So I would say, before I get to your question, that so much of what Tony has just said is obviously relevant to the U.S. There are millions and millions of people, I love his phrase, who are politically homeless. They don't feel that they have a home in either the Republican or Democratic Party because they feel increasingly that both parties have been taken over by the further left and the further right. And even more than that, now we get more to process, really, as much to process as to substance, that the both parties are not working together to get anything done to solve problems. And this is where we get to win or lose, and where I want to offer a strange bit of encouragement or optimism. I was fascinated this week at one point, and that's when the president had his second productive, apparently, meeting with Chuck and Nancy, as he calls them, about this one, about DACA. And somebody in the press the next day or two shouted a question to him, what do you say to the conservatives in your party so angry about what you're doing? And he said in classic Trumpian style, I want to win. I want to win. And so basically working with Democrats is one way to win. So, but you're right. We're building, Kathleen, on a period of years, really. It's gotten worse over decades. But certainly was, in my 24 years in the Senate, it got increasingly partisan, less functional, more ideologically rigid, more win and lose. And as you know, after one election, what do you focus on? How are we going to throw out the guys who won in the last election? There's no time given to negotiating, to governing, to doing. And as a result, Congress particularly is held in all-time disregard. It's part of why I think Trump got elected last year. We can talk about that if you want. So we've got to get over create a new definition, maybe for the moment at least, the Trumpian definition of winning, which is winning means solving problems. Winning means Democrats and Republicans working together. As Tom Reed, winning means the Problem Solvers Caucus, which, just to put a little pressure on Galston and Crystal, in the whole galaxy of the No Labels family, we parents are most proud of the Problem Solvers Caucus. So you guys in the new center will just have to work very hard to equal that. I'm sure you can. Bill is accustomed to parental guilt, induction, stimulating, great words. Okay, I should.
Aren't we all?
We are. I should stop there. But there's a yearning hunger for a new center, and what we have in mind. Maybe they said it before we came in. First, starting with ideas, fresh ideas that both parties can get together on. Second, creating this site. I don't know if they talked about it. That'll do for the center what Drudge does for the right and Huffington for the left. And where does it lead? We don't know. I mean, it can certainly be supportive of the Problem Solvers Caucus and anybody else wants to work across party lines, including people in the administration on the grounds of policy. I leave it to you. Does it lead to a third party? That's not our ambition, our aim, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, let's talk about that. Do either of you feel that this can be accomplished within the current party structure? Do you foresee having to create a third party? And in conjunction with that thought, are you thinking in terms of eventually presenting a political figure, not necessarily from this room, but someone who would be, qualified and possibly could sell himself as a centrist political presidential candidate? I guess that's for you, since
We've got the Queen, not a president.
You don't
this is one for Joe.
your problems are half solved.
That's good.
Well, I don't know that. I've never heard anyone say that a third party would do well in this country, so I'm curious.
So the history obviously argues against it. I mean, but we have had some, two things have happened. One is, and you have to go back a long way to the Whigs, and I was with a former Republican governor the other night, and he said that he thinks we may be watching the beginning of the dissolution of the Republican Party, that it may break into pieces, as the Whigs did. One piece died, and the other piece became the Republican Party and elected Lincoln in 1860. But, you have to go back that far. We've had cases where third-party candidates have gotten a lot of votes and affected what the other parties did, most recently Ross Perot, of course.
Yeah.
In some ways, fortunately, he didn't affect President Clinton's policy on trade, on NAFTA, but he did affect the administration and others on the balanced budget, and through his genius, President Clinton was able to do that with Newt Gingrich. So I would say that both parties in America are under stress now. I supported Secretary Clinton for a lot of reasons. Last year I was confident she would be an excellent president, just so qualified in every way, and I felt comfortable with her in terms of the positions I thought she'd take. From a political point of view, frankly, I also reached a personal conclusion that she might well be our last hope for some period of time to have a center-left Democratic Party and not a left-left Democratic Party. And wow, I hate to pat myself on the back. Maybe I wasn't a brilliant prognosis, but the party just looks like it's chasing after Bernie, really, to get as far left as they can. And there's no home for people like me in it, and nor is there going to be home for all those politically homeless centrists. The Republicans, on the other hand, and allowing in part for Trump's, shall we say, unique personality, a lot of traditional Republicans, and I don't know what you'd call them. Some of them are Bush Republicans, but it's much broader than that, are not comfortable in Trump's Republican Party. Part of the reason is they're not so sure he's a Republican, and they're right.
Well, exactly. I think the last week has shown us that. He's hanging out with Chuck and Nancy. He's now saying he's not going to pull out of the Paris Accord. So he's actually becoming the Democrat he's always been, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And I wonder, though, if he's positioning himself, he says he wants to win, but maybe he's, in fact, creating a centrist sort of approach to solving problems. Maybe, are we willing to give him that?
Well, he did run, I'll say this briefly, and then yield to
Well, I want to hear
Prime
about the
Minister.
Labor Party.
Okay, good. I mean, just say briefly that if you look at his programs that he ran on, he did run as something of an independent. I wouldn't call it a moderate. He was quite socially conservative, which nobody really thinks he is, personally. But then he did something that was really sin among the Republican Party that I worked with in Congress. He said throughout the campaign he would not touch Social Security and Medicare. But I think he had a political insight there in terms of wanting to win, that was a precondition for him to get the support of alienated Democrats, that they were angry at here's the irony, angry at the government, but dependent on those government programs for their security later in life. So in a whole mix of ways, he ended up being totally unconventional. Also, of course, essentially sounded like an isolationist, which is not where the Republican Party has been. So since he's been in office, it's not quite clear which of those positions he holds dear and what he'll stick to. And so it's a puzzle where he'll be if he wants to run again in 2020.
Yeah.
Well, that's the question. So, Mr. Blair, do you see parallels to the Labor Party?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the same situation, I would say. I mean, obviously my hope is that the British Labour Party comes back to the centre of its own accord. It's not clear, though, for the moment that it will. And there's a large part of the Conservative Party, that would feel more in common with the centre of the Labour Party or the centrists in the Labour Party than they would with those people who are on the far right, who either want to make immigration a great campaigning slogan or for a hard Brexit. So I think the real question is, can you establish a sufficient coherence of ideas that you're not, as it were, just like a magpie picking things, different bits? And I would say, actually, in relation to whatever your president does here, you can only establish something that is new, either with the existing party structure or outside of it, if there is what I would call a sort of broad strategic coherence, as well as merely a tactical opportunism. And that's why the policy stuff is so important, because it's got to derive from certain very clear principles. And those principles, I think, are about how you combine notions of equality with enterprise, how you, as it were, engage with the more liberal, socially liberal way that society is today, particularly amongst those people under the age of 50, as it were, how you ensure that you deal with immigration in a way that is fair, but where you're not stigmatizing immigrants or using them as a political football, and where you are prepared to make business responsible, but you actually value the notion of a thriving business sector. Now, that basic sort of set of ideas, or set of almost quasi-philosophical principles, I can see how you can build that into a series of things that people in the centrists and the Republicans or the Democrats could support, centrists in the Labour Party or the Conservative Party could support. And I think this goes in one of two ways. I either think you actually start to make a thing of cooperating. That's why I love your problem solvers caucus idea. I think it's a great idea. And by the way, you could do something very, very similar in the UK Parliament at the moment, where you either make a point of actually bringing people together across the party divide, or if that becomes very hard, then I don't think it actually matters what I say or even what Joe says or any other person in politics. At some point in time in our type of society, if you just leave this vacuum, it's going to be filled.
Right.
And right now in the UK, there's enormous political energy outside of Parliament, where people are saying, "Come on, this is ridiculous." And if you analyze, for example, in our situation, but you can see this in many different in the politics of many different European countries, you have a left that starts to go after two things. It targets business in a way that is actually anti-business and not in favor of responsible business. And then it starts to try and build a coalition of people based on identity, where you kind of add up this group and that minority and so on and so forth, and then you go right for an election campaign. I don't find that progressive. So, I mean, my problem, I always say this to people, my problem is not these people are too left, I just don't find it progressive. So, there's all sorts of answers to the problems, for example, of tuition fees, because they're a problem here, they're a problem in the UK, and so on and so forth, and you need to find a solution to it. But, promising everyone everything for free isn't progressive. It's just it's a mindset which is basically oppositional, and it's not geared to what you can really do in achieving government, right? So this is, very fundamental. So what I'm saying is you've got this, certainly on the left, in Europe, you've got a group of people who are pulling politics to the far left, but it's contested. And if it's not contested sufficiently by the people within the structures of parliament and party, it's going to be contested outside. And, the one thing I would say about politics today is, the one predictable element is its unpredictability. We live in highly volatile political times. And so for exactly the same reasons that some of us have not been predicting correctly the path of elections and referendums and so on, is exactly the same reason why I don't think you can predict that, because things have always been in this way, in terms of political structure, they'll always stay in that way. Now, as I say, my desire, because it's so much simpler, and because all the headwinds that starting something new are so great, my desire is for my own political party to come back to the centre. My desire is actually for the Conservative Party to do the same, because I think that's much more healthy for the country. But some things we can control and some things we can't. We can work for that, but if it doesn't happen, then I'm quite sure that powerful political energy is not just going to, it's not just going to be wandering the earth homeless forever.
Yeah.
If I may be real brief, Tony's raised a question that I think is really important for us to consider in an American context, which is we do have this growing politically homeless group of tens of millions. And right now, I don't see that either party is going to move to the center to accommodate them. I think there are going to be some inside the institution collaboration that may produce some results. It may affect the two parties. But we have a problem here in this country, which goes back to the earlier question that was asked, which is it's very hard to form a third party. I mean, even if there are millions of people out there wanting to have one to vote for, and the irony here is that, the parties are not in the Constitution. There's no law that says we have to have two major parties, but over time, the two parties have insinuated themselves in the system, sometime in state election laws. Not easy to get on the ballot to run as a third-party candidate for president in every state. And so we'll see.
Can I ask a question, Joe? In your system, for example, when you do the Problem Solvers Caucus,
Yes.
I mean, what happens with the individual representatives in their own political parties? I mean, are they under pressure for that, or people like that, or they
They
do they have problems when they're running for nomination?
They are, and I'll tell you, we started out in No Labels really trying to bring...
Or is that a really dumb British question?
No, it's a great question. I mean, we started out trying to bring Democrats and Republicans together to talk about issues and work together. And then at some point we said, this is a political problem, this dysfunction, and it's only going to be solved politically. So we've got to encourage a group of Democrats and Republicans to get together and work together and tell them that we will have their backs. I mean, and I'll be blunt, because most of you have been involved in it. Your party may threaten not to raise money for you if you work with the other party. We're going to raise money for you, and we did that even before they began to do as well as they have been, just to show that we were serious about it. And last year we got, as I mentioned to you briefly, we got into 2 primaries where we supported, this was another spin-off operation, 2 moderate candidates, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican primary, against 2 extreme candidates, and we won both of them. So, but yeah, they're under, maybe you want to add, Tom, but they're under constant pressure from their leadership.
Yeah.
Well, if I could, I will say, thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm Tom Reed. I co-chair the Problem Solvers Caucus on the Republican side. And to your point, as a member who feels that heat, and to my colleague on the other side, Josh Gottheimer, leadership feels threatened because they're losing control potentially of the process within our House and congressional activities. And then also, so what happens is because of that, they will directly put a tremendous amount of pressure on us to get back on board with our extremes in the party. But to the credit of my colleagues in the Problem Solvers Caucus, they agree with us, and kind of to those tens of millions of voices that are out there that we kind of adhere to, is we're saying enough. Enough is enough. And thank goodness we have people stepping up, and thank you to everyone in this room for the support, because without that support, we would not survive. Now we're able to survive because we have a network of those millions across the country that will stand with us.
Here, here.
So I think this is where your ideas for the new centre is so important, because I think here's part of the problem. I think when I was in office and in President Clinton's time for sure, there was a general spirit of optimism. People felt. People pretty much felt there weren't many problems we couldn't solve. We put our mind to it and things were making progress. I think these last years, the politics of fear and pessimism have been much more visible. And therefore what happens is that if someone comes along and says, not here's a way to solve the problem, but here's who to blame, it's a much more, especially in the social media world, it's a much more powerful galvanizing force. And what we've got to do, I think, is 2 things, is to translate the notion of cooperation into something that is a powerful political, idea, which is, in contradistinction to the failure of that type of very partisan politics, but also to have the ideas where people can have their spirit of hope and optimism rekindled. And this is where I think, I was just looking through your policy agenda around things like tax reform and infrastructure, for example. It's really important. The whole role of technology. I find as a public policy maker or politician, there's a woeful inadequacy between the interaction of the world of the world of technology that's changing the world we live in and the policy makers that are trying to deal with the outcome and product of it. We've got a whole series of issues which are obviously very, very powerful and sometimes divisive issues like immigration, where we've got to be able to provide people with the notion that you can find a way through the difficulties. So I think, this is only going to be, it's only going to be resolved if it's clear that that broad philosophical position can give rise to a policy agenda that people feel, okay, I can rethink this now. Because in the polling my institute does, we've found that this generation thinks it's done better than the last generation, but it's fearful that the next generation won't. And that generational switch is a change, by the way. That's a change. So we need to work out how we bring that back, that
We're
idea.
going to open the floor to questions, but I want to just ask you one more quickly. You brought up immigration. You've changed your views on immigration, and we tie that to Brexit, which you think you've made some pretty stimulating suggestions for how
That's a polite way of putting it.
how Brexit could be reversed and also help with the immigration concerns.
Yeah, I mean, truth, I haven't reversed my views on immigration really, but the majority of immigration in the UK is non-EU immigration, but the immigration issue, including EU immigration, really was the driving force behind the Brexit vote. And, my view is that what people want on immigration, or at least where you can galvanize a majority, is they want rules but not prejudices. Okay. But what they fear is there aren't rules. And where there are no rules, then they get anxious. and they see their communities changing around them. And then I think in Europe, particularly in the UK, there are cultural questions, particularly when you get people in from conservative Muslim backgrounds and people feel they don't really share our value system. So you've got a range of very specific immigration problems, and then you've got a very clear generic problem, which is around the absence of controls. And in my view, you've got to listen to those concerns. You can't just condemn them out of hand. And if you don't listen to them, then people feel you just don't get it. And this is what we're trying to do, is to articulate an immigration policy that allows us to proclaim why immigration is actually overall a great benefit to our country, to root out prejudice against immigrants wherever it is, but to make sure that people feel that the system is a system and that it has some integrity to it.
Okay, so we do have a microphone, and we have our first hand raised here. Or we have this one, Jane Harmon's.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jane Harmon. I'm an old centrist. And I'm also an escapee from the United States Congress. I left in my 9th term to head the Wilson Center because the partisanship was insufferable. And being in a nonpartisan idea factory is much more pleasant. I think the brilliance of this is that you have a series of substantive ideas. You have a vision for the center. And I certainly agree with Tony that it's not just the middle of the spectrum. It's a place where you can actually come up with an active program that could appeal to both sides. But my question is, given the holy grail in Congress, maybe true in Britain too, which is now getting reelected, which trumps solving problems or helping the country, can you how important is process? It's not just about a third party, but I'm from California, where we have changed process. We have citizen commission drawing congressional lines. We have what's called a jungle primary, where both parties run, and the top 2 vote getters are the runoff, and it could be 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans. And a third piece that we haven't been able to figure out is money, getting some money out. So my question is, in addition to a really brilliant set of ideas that both parties could buy, how important is it to change process?
Well, it's very important. I mean, I think we've decided for now that we can't do everything, and other groups are working on that, on changes in process. But I think the California initiatives in this regard are very important because, as you know, they respond to one of the big causes of the partisanship, particularly in the House, which is that of the 435 seats, generally speaking, analysts think that only about 90% at most are competitive on election day. It's all about the primary. 10%. Pardon? 10%. I'm sorry, 10%, 90% are not competitive, right? And so it's all, we're trying to break that structure. And I think that and it happens, incidentally, also in states that are mostly blue or mostly red, and when it comes to the Senate. So process is important. Look, if the 2 parties don't deliver, there are going to be those millions of people looking for an alternative, and they may actually press for changes in the process to allow a third party to come along, or whatever the latest iteration of Michael Bloomberg will appear and run as a third party candidate. He tells me he's not going to do it. But, there's a certain, I think there'll be an appeal to that. There's somebody else out there.
Yes.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Daniel Arbus, been involved with No Labels pretty much since the beginning, as you know. Nice to see you again, Mr. Prime Minister. I wanted to offer 2 observations very quickly by way of questions. Prime Minister referred to the role of technology, especially social media, on politics and how social media has disrupted politics. What I wanted to offer you is the thought that it's the role of technology on people's lives that is the most important. If you think about how Donald Trump was elected, it was by speaking directly to voters and telling them that he heard their existential and economic insecurities, both of which have their roots in politics. existential insecurity has to do with, in technology rather, existential insecurity has to do with people's sense of vulnerability to decentralized non-state actors propagating terror. And economic insecurity has to do with the role of technology displacing capital and labor in traditional industries. So labor participation, which is what's spoken about prominently in the new center's materials here. I just wanted to offer that thought as a broadening of the framework outside the process of politics to what's shaping the political environment in people's lives. And then second, Joe, and thank you again for recognizing the question, I wanted to make the observation that you and I have spoken about before about our two-party system. If one looks back in history at the consensus of the center that has moved the country forward in the post-war political era, it's got three elements. It's liberal, increasingly liberal social policies, conservative but still compassionate market economic policies, and principled foreign policies that reflect the values of liberty and other values of the United States. If you look at the horizon today, I think you would both agree that the Democratic Party reflects the majority consensus on social policies. The Republican Party is closer on economic policies, and at the moment, foreign policy, as we all know, is a jump ball. I wanted to raise that as a framework for you, Joe, and a framework for you, Prime Minister Blair, just to comment on in both of those areas. Thank you.
I mean, I'd start briefly. I think, Dan, what you've raised is very important, and there is a way in which part of what's happening now in both parties here in this country is a rejection, in part or in whole, of some of the big ideas, big policies that have really structured the world after World War II. And they have worked incredibly to create wealth, to diminish poverty, I could go on and on. We're living longer as a result. So I'd say in part it's belief in liberal democracy, internationalism in a political sense, and market economics and free or fair trade. Now, I think we're at a point where, because, incidentally, going to your first question, I think the real reason, I think there are two reasons for people's anxiety and anger. One, incidentally, is the government itself. I think part of the pessimism that people have is that the people in the government are screaming at each other all the time and nothing's getting done. I actually think that, though you can't say on the substance, the Trump-Schumer-Pelosi agreement on the three parts of the budget, et cetera, was an enormous deal. It created peace for 3 months, and I bet the president's numbers are going to go up as a result. I mean, he got something done, so that's part of it. But the other part, and this really is the cause of what's creating the anxiety, and it's not, although I agree with Tony about what has to happen with immigration, it's not immigrants. The real cause of dislocation economically is a force larger than whether we can secure our borders. It's the extraordinary pace of technological change, which, generally speaking, has benefited most of us and is, in terms of medical system, keeping us alive longer. We can go on and on. Better information access, entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I think you're right on target. Now, it may sound unfashionable to say, oh, we're here to protect and we never will say this, here to protect the foundation points of the post-Second World War, Second World War world, but I would never phrase it that way, but there were parts of it that have really worked, and we don't want to throw them out in some burst of populistic emotion. They need change. Nothing should stay the same, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They need renewal, and I think this is what's very important. It's a long way down there.
We did it.
Yeah, you see, I think Dan, your 3 points are actually very interesting just to spend a moment on. So, social liberalism, as I was saying earlier, I think for the younger generation, but actually for us, right, is something we welcome. And the left has more traditionally championed that. The thing is this, though. You've got to keep true to its intrinsic benefits and not let that trend into something that can become actually very off-putting for people. So one thing I notice now is that people who defend social liberalism or articulate social liberalism can do so in a very illiberal way, in a way that actually starts to put people off. Right? So if you're hearing that, and you're seeing, for example, on college campuses, people being kind of shouted down and not allowed to speak, or if you think that perfectly justified concern to make sure your law enforcement is fair in a racial sense, right, then comes into apparently or seemingly anti-law enforcement officers as a whole, right, you are going to alienate people. Right? And you're going to give the right something that they will campaign on very strongly, and they'll touch a lot of people on that. So social liberalism is absolutely correct, but it's got to be, as I say, true to its intrinsic values. Likewise, when you come to the second part on the economy, which is usually more favored on the conservative side, in a world of accelerating change, and this is absolutely key because the whole, big data, AI, automation is going to be changing the whole world of work. The free market can't be you're on your own. Right. So again, that is going to require adjustment because it was never supposed to be the free market for the worship of the market, but the free market is the most effective way to produce wealth with an obligation to use that wealth fairly and to distribute it fairly too, to help those without. And then when you come to foreign policy, foreign policy, the context will be very different today because we're going to grow, the 21st century is going to be a multipolar world. But the basic international engagement and the belief that this is important, that's got to stay with us. So my point is that when you look at your 3 elements, I totally agree, those are the 3 elements that really drive our politics. There are sensible centrist positions on each of those things that actually the purpose of it will be to return those things to where they should be. And, just one other thing, which is to say, despite everything, Macron's victory in France was extraordinary, and, Angela Merkel will probably be returned in Germany, and with some sort of coalition which will be, again, pretty much in the center. But what's interesting to me is about the Macron victory in particular, when we did polling of the French electorate, the numbers that want to change were 90%. Right. So the thing, he is a centrist candidate, but he came specifically to effect change. So this is the other thing I say. So I think we can put your 3 things in the right philosophical context, but then I think the policies that come out of it have got to answer the case for change. And it's when people don't think the system is responding to their need for change that they'll follow the Pied Pipers, left or right, who will dance them off into the wilderness.
That's exactly what this is.
It is.
I've known you since we first met when you were a backbencher over nuclear arms policy issues, and you just nailed it. You just described it.
We have
I was
5
always good
minutes.
at promotion.
Oh, more
We have 5 minutes and 3 hands. Are you next? You have a microphone.
Microphone.
So you must be next.
Dennis Blair, no relation that I'm aware of, Prime Minister. But
Admiral of the U.S. Navy, former Director of National Intelligence.
Yes.
I could go on.
But on this interaction between national security policy and the center, at least in this country, I always had the feeling that our bipartisan national security policy under great threat from the Soviet Union helped hold that center together and also gave us the excuse for doing some things that were pretty hard that we needed to do nationally. Really working on the education system after Sputnik and many other things that were
we thought we ought to do to keep up to compete. I wonder, Joe, do you think the loss of that is given a certain incoherence to the center in a way that it used to hold us together? And I know that Britain had a different experience. In fact, your personal experience in foreign affairs being extremely divisive when you did what you thought was right. And did that affect your ability to get things done domestically? And in all of these projects, there's not a word about sensible national security policy or bipartisan or what the beliefs are. It's all fixing the economy, fixing social problems, and so on. Are we missing a dimension there, or do you think we can do it and let the foreign policy, national security policy be worked out as sort of a separate sphere of operation?
Well, I should leave that to Bill and Bill, but I mean, my own feeling about it is we're starting with domestic policy, and I think eventually we have to get to foreign policy. We've talked some about the importance of defending the ideal of liberal democracy in the world, and it needs defense, and it still is the most captivating for most of the people in the world, notwithstanding some of the rise of demagogues. But to go back to your question, Admiral, you're right that one of the disconcerting things I watched happen in Congress over the 24 years I was there was that major foreign policy questions seemed to be decided more along party lines. And that wasn't the case when I arrived. And it shouldn't be the case at all. And what's interesting, and again, it speaks to, I suppose, the leadership role of people in office, even if they're leading people in the wrong direction, is that that seems to be reflected in public opinion polling now on issues that don't seem to be foreign policy issues, don't seem to be partisan, but you get most of the Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other. There are exceptions, clearly. I mean, in the post 9/11 period, there was great bipartisan cooperation to develop some of the governmental responses to 9/11. I mean, it is fascinating. I just end here, which is to watch Trump, who was, I'm speaking simplistically, ran on America First, was an isolationist. That's appropriate, because we're saying, yeah, isolationist policy and et cetera. And yet, here he is in office. He's the president. He's commander-in-chief. And reality has conflicted with that political approach. So he ends up being the one, I don't want to overstate the importance of this, who responds to Assad's use of chemical weapons in Syria. And he's all over the Middle East peace process, which Tony has been such a hero in, and also very actively involved now in the whole question of policy with Russia. Also, I think he's come to understand that the focus he's had on a kind of economic nationalism, which itself is, I think, risky for the country if it goes too far, inevitably intersects with our international relations, for instance, with China or Russia, or et cetera. So he's turning a bit, but the two parties are still at each other's necks too often on these problems. The old, what was his name, Vandenberg, the post-war president who was a conservative Republican who joined with President Truman in supporting the creation of our post-war foreign policy. He said that, I'm paraphrasing, partisanship should end at the nation's borders, at the water's edge. And we've lost that, I'm afraid.
I mean, I think.
No, go ahead. I was just going to, I think they want us to wrap up, but I wanted to ask whether there's time for these two who've been waiting patiently for.
Sure.
Raise your hands again, please. There you go.
Tom McInerney, I'm CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I want to bring a business perspective. When I started work in the late 70s with college education, with the difference between a college education and a high school education, because manufacturing, compensation-wise, was not very different. And it seems to me that, and I've had the privilege over my career to run businesses in Europe and the UK and the US, and as well as in Asia, but that a challenge in both the UK and the US is that our education system is not producing, whether it's college or apprentices or whatever, but the majority of the middle class with the skill sets that will allow them to earn enough to have quality of life. And it seems to me that when technology and the political and the center ultimately, and I know Prime Minister, you spent time on this, and I know Senator, you as well, I do think the focus of solving these problems, a lot of it is to prepare citizens in whatever way that is, so that they because they can no longer, like they could in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, have a high school or an equivalent in the UK and be very successful. But today, that's probably no longer the case, and it isn't a big part of the focus. To take the fear away is to give citizens in both countries and around the world the skills so that they can be competitive on their own.
Want to go to, maybe we'll go to Carrie and then.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to draw the conversation back a little bit, if I could, to that question about foreign policy and what the Prime Minister and the Senator would imagine as the basic tenets of a moderate foreign policy, if such a thing existed. And you might want to think about it in terms of what Senator Lieberman was also saying, like, what kind of foreign policy do you believe we all as Americans could get behind that the partisanship could end at the shores at this point in time?
We always felt that de Tocqueville understood America a lot better than we did. So I'm going to yield to you based on that premise.
Hello, Joe is much more expert than me, really, but it's. Here's what I think about this. I think the Admiral's absolutely right that there's a lot. It's a lot harder to make the foreign policy aspect of this really come alive for people in today's world. But I think it is really important, really, really important, because it's a large part of who we are and the values we believe in. And I think you could construct a foreign policy today that is internationalist, that is measured, that takes an enlightened view of self-interest, and that builds alliances in support of our values in a way that gives hope to our own people and to the outside world. I mean, let me give you an example of what I mean by that, because I've just come from Ukraine yesterday. You know, there is a country that basically wants to choose a European destiny. Okay. And, you know, some people, because of the way foreign policy is conducted right now, which I think is quite sort of self-interested and almost value-free, people say, well, look, you know, aren't they in the Russian sphere of interest? You know, why are we bothering with this? And so on and so forth. And yet, at the heart of this issue around Ukraine is something really fundamental to us. Because I've had this conversation with many people on the more Russian side of the argument. And I say to them, look, if Ukraine decides it wants to go in the Russian direction, that's their choice. But if they decide they want a European destiny, then it's their right to claim that destiny and our duty to help them. And this is an important part of who we are. And you know, you go there and you see these people who are still with this frozen conflict in the east of the country. You realize, for example, what would be happening in Eastern Europe if those countries hadn't come into NATO in the European Union. And this is important for us. Now, okay, and I went through Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, and I know all the difficulties of foreign policy. But ultimately, you know, this is fundamental to who we are. And it's certainly absolutely fundamental to my politics. I don't believe we're just about interests. We are about values. And I know many, many people around the world who look to this country and look to my country as a source of inspiration. And if it all becomes about frankly, well, my country comes first. You guys, if it suits us, yes, but if it doesn't suit us, I'm afraid you can just be traded away. No, this to me is not acceptable. So I think it's difficult, but I do believe that you can get people behind this. I have a situation. Sorry, I'm going, but I mean, I have a situation where, right now in the left in the UK, if the American president comes to town, there'll be masses of people out in the street protesting. Right? You can get a protest going about Israel, the click of a fingers. There's virtually no protest about what's been happening in Russia and interference in Syria and the interference there at all. These are not progressive positions. So I think this is a very important part of the debate, actually. Anyway, I've gone too long, but I think.
All right, well, I let them
Well
run over
done.
a little
I
bit
agree.
because I could listen to them talk for several more hours, but I think that I'm going to stop now.
Thank you, Prime Minister Blair and Senator Lieberman and Kathleen Parker for a terrific panel.
Good. Thanks so much.
Enjoyed a lot.
Thank you.
Next up, we're going to hear some fascinating and instructive data on the current state of America from Mark Penn, founder and president of the Stagwell Group and former chief strategist to President Bill Clinton.
Okay. I'm going to give you American public opinion kind of in a nutshell in just a couple of minutes, and so that I think you kind of reset kind of where America is from where you read where America is. The first thing I'd say is these are the happiest unhappy people I have ever seen in my polling life, right? Or I should reverse it. They're the unhappiest happy people I've ever seen in my life. Meaning, if you ask them, is the economy on the right track or the wrong track, they say the economy is on the right track. If you ask them, is the country on the right track, on the wrong track, almost 65% say the wrong track. If you ask them, is the economy growing, 2/3 say the economy is growing. If you ask them, are they getting the American dream, over 60% say they're living the American dream or expect to live it. They're relatively as satisfied with the economy as I have seen since pretty much 1996, to 2000, right? And yet, they're as unhappy with the direction of the country, which means that their unhappiness is quite deep. But it's paradoxically not about the state of their own lives, which is typically the root of unhappiness. So, who does the public like? Basically, no one. Bernie Sanders is the only one who has, of the well-known figures, over 50% rating, and that's been declining as he started to get involved with issues. People liked him when he was kind of more avuncular and out there, but now that he got in issues, he's coming down. What do they think of Trump? Well, somewhere between, depending upon what poll you read, 35% and 45%, and frankly, he got 46% in the last election, and almost all of his base in every poll shows that they're sticking with him. So I'm a little dubious of polls that put his support down in the 30s, just when you look at what he performed and what his voters say about him. Hillary is actually getting less support than Trump, because not only is she not liked by all the Trump voters, but the Sanders voters don't like her, leaving an even smaller sliver of the election for her. Now, 58% don't like the Democrats and say that they're doing a bad job. Now, it was about 60% who didn't like the Republicans. That is now 68%. So who do they like? No one. Who do they dislike? Everyone. They think the media is biased. They think the courts are filled with judges that decide things on politics instead of law. And so they're about as disillusioned with their institutions, while at the same time about as happy with their own lives, have more smartphones, televisions, we sold a record number of cars in the previous number of years than you can imagine. Now, of course, there are About a third of the country is unhappy economically, so don't let me try to suggest that everyone is happy. There is a solid third, but it's not 2/3 that are unhappy. It's about a third. Where do they come out on issues? There is no central issue. If you go back to classic times of unhappiness, usually a single issue, say the economy or jobs or inflation or healthcare, would dominate the scene. Jobs and the economy are slightly higher issues, but no issue is really more than 15%. Do they favor common sense or problem solving or centrist solutions to most problems? They absolutely do. Take Korea. 90% think that North Korea should get nuclear weapons, but most people do not want to attack North Korea. Most people want to give North Korea the toughest possible sanctions. So they want the problem dealt with. They don't want to go to war. They do want to put sanctions on. Where are they on immigration? Well, 62% don't want a wall. 80% don't want sanctuary cities. They do want people who are here, children who are brought here to have work permits. They do want to resolve the issue somewhere in the center. They don't want open borders. Now, someone here said, hey, don't worry, we're all social liberals now. That's not entirely true. There's a lot more social conservatism that drove both the Trump victory and the Republican Party than, frankly, Democrats and people sitting in New York City really want to admit. But whether it comes to finances or health care, they don't want single payer. They don't want full free market solutions. There is time and time again clear centrist momentum for solutions to our problems. Why is that? Ask them if they're conservative, liberal, or moderate. Liberals are only about 25% of the country. They made a big change in the last 5 years. They were 24. Now they may be up to 27. Right? Conservatives are about 35, and moderates are about 40%. As I've said before, the problem is America is much like a restaurant with chicken and fish on the menu, and everybody wants steak. Right? And what does that mean when I say that? I mean 54% of the Democrats are liberal, 66% of the Republicans are conservative. Every person who wants to run for president or get the approval of the voters of their party is driven increasingly to the extremes, and the result is the large centrist group, the steak eaters, if you will, don't have anything to eat, it's not on the menu, and they're being gradually disenfranchised. Now, in all of this discontent and all of this rancor, what is the one question that I get 91% agreement on? That one question is, should people from Democratic and Republican parties compromise on their differences to resolve problems, or should they stick to their principles? 91% say compromise and find solutions, which is why the Problem Solvers Caucus, when they started to come out with bipartisan solutions, whoa, all of a sudden, a light bulb went off, right? And that light bulb is that as divided as the public may be, the truth is they're united on the idea that we ought to find common sense, centrist solutions to our problems and move forward. Finally, I would say, if you're looking for, I wouldn't say finally, almost finally, I would say behind all public opinion are really the two movements of globalization and technology and how they are affecting our society. Globalization is creating the issues of trade, immigration, taxes, competitive behavior, a competitive advantage, productivity. All of those issues are a result of the trend, the massive trend of globalization. And technology, with AI, with big data, with automation, with the lack of privacy, with the economic concentration that we're seeing among the tech companies, those two forces are what is creating such tremendous upheaval and uncertainty among people's futures. It drives a lot of the cultural issues as they relate to immigration. It drives a lot of the workplace fear as it relates to, will I have a job? Will I have a job once automation really takes root? And so unless you understand that those are the roots, you can never really, I think, address the unease, dissatisfaction, and concern that you see in the public, because it is more about the future than it is about their present lives. Finally, in this overview, I would say one area that I would just highlight in terms of public opinion is the idea of free speech. Free speech is, I think, in some ways under assault, and yet when I poll on it, I get some very interesting findings. If I ask people, are you comfortable giving your political views at home? 40% are not comfortable expressing their political views at home. Mostly, there is a huge gender gap, so women and men actually have tremendous political differences in this country, and probably it's the most difficult single conversation around the dinner table at the moment. Now, but when I say at the workplace, are you comfortable expressing your political views at the workplace? 60% say that they are uncomfortable expressing their political views at the workplace. So in a country founded on free speech, almost half the country is uncomfortable expressing their own views, and with good reason, because if you express views that are outside the mainstream at the workplace, typically today you get fired. And so one of the things I pointed out in an article and we polled on is 70% would extend First Amendment protections to the workplace. That one of the interesting things is that at the time the First Amendment was written, people were concerned about government shutting down speech. They didn't have the phenomenon of an online mob going to your employer saying that you have to be fired, and your employer firing you because he or she cannot say, I can't fire them because of the First Amendment. They instead fire them. And so you're having this increasing discomfort with people, particularly, I think, in the center, being able to express their views, and you're seeing the extremes having more and more of the public voice in the parties, in the media, almost taken as a given that there's no point talking about issues and trying to find centrist solutions, because centrist solutions displease people on the right and they displease people on the left. Those people govern the debate, and then that kind of discussion is discarded. So I'd highlight, just to review, we are a divided country. We're a divided country that right now doesn't like its institutions, doesn't like its leaders, but wants to see bipartisan cooperation, has a surprisingly common sense view of the solutions. I would be concerned about the two issues of globalization, technology. Have we made some mistakes in how we've prepared society for how they're playing out? And what is happening to what I think Tony Blair talks about as liberal democracy that is founded on the ability to have free speech, debate, and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We have a little set change going on here before our next panel. Maybe started with Real Clear Politics, and I'm excited to be included in this today. Most often when I speak to groups, I talk about Congress, and I warn them that it's not my fault when I get up. It's really nice to be here today to talk about something positive. I'm really impressed by the work that Bill Galston and Bill Kristol have endeavored upon. And I urge you today, or in the week that follows, to really give this a read. You will learn a lot, and it will make you feel a lot better about some kind of consensus for common sense, reasonable starting points for a path ahead that both parties should be able to embrace. And I'm also really impressed by the panel of experts that we've put together today to talk about the different proposals in the book, Ideas to Recenter America. And my stars are here. I'm going to let them sit down. Welcome.
What order we go?
So I'm going to start with Ryan. Oh, well, that'd be nice. Just in case I'm going to start with Ryan Clancy. Ryan, Ryan formerly served in the Obama administration as a speechwriter at the Commerce Department and for Vice President Biden, and today works closely with companies, campaigns, and leaders on communication strategy. He's worked for several years as a senior advisor and strategist for No Labels, and he worked closely with Bill Galston and Bill Kristol on this project, the New Center team, researching and writing ideas to recenter America. Ryan, in this book, a grand bargain of sorts is proposed, pairing a deal on tax reform and infrastructure. Tell us how and why these two big projects should be combined.
Sure. So, as we sort of mentioned earlier, when you look at all the ideas in this booklet, they all have to do, in large part, with either growing the economy, growing the pie, or having a more equitable share of it. I think what we see a lot is Republicans, certainly in America, focus a lot on growing the economy, the left increasingly on the who gets what. But when you focus on both to the exclusion of everything else, you don't really get either. And so what we look at with tax and infrastructure is this is very much focused on the growth aspect. As a lot of you know, the post-World War II growth rate for the U.S. has been about 3% usually. Until the last decade, it's been about 2%. Until you fix that, really nothing's possible. The world in which we're growing at 3% is a world in which we can manage our challenges. A world when it's 2%, we really can't. And tax reform and infrastructure is really the perfect natural bargain to stimulate investment in this country. Everybody knows the tax system is a disaster. Everybody knows our infrastructure is falling apart. Anybody that came up here on the Acela can certainly attest to that. And so what we look at here is this is the perfect political bargain for the right and the left. It has a political logic. It's something the right wants, tax reform. Democrats really want infrastructure. But there's some real policy logic behind it as well. If you do tax reform right, you get a bunch of money that's stowed abroad that can come back here and be reinvested in infrastructure. So in terms of the outlines of the actual ideas, which you'll find in the booklet, a lot of the ideas we put forth for tax reform, they're really principles. They're things people will have seen before. But the basic concept is the way they did it in 1986 is the way they should do it today. A large grand bargain, you bring down the rates, get out a lot of the deductions and loopholes, 15,000 of which Congress has added since 1986. And then on infrastructure, it's both a financing and a regulatory challenge. So we have to get a lot more creative about how we fund this. But there's also how we get it built. We have all these, ridiculous environmental regulations. You can't build a highway because it's going to knock down a coconut tree or something. And it takes us 8 years to build a project that in Germany they could do 2. So that's the basic idea. And by the way, though we think this is an original idea and it would be the perfect bargain, it is, Congressman Reed, it's basically the position of the Problem Solvers Caucus to pair tax reform and infrastructure together. Paul Ryan and Chuck Schumer were circling around a deal like this a couple of years ago, and we think it'd be time to resuscitate it.
Ryan, another thing that the book focuses on very closely is intellectual property as the crown jewel of our economy. It's obviously under great threat. How can we diminish the forces undermining our competitive advantage?
So this was another part of when we look at what do we need to spur economic growth. Tax reform's a part of it, investment's a part of it, but of course innovation is a huge part of that. And it really is the crown jewel of our economy. One of the things we explore in the book is that everybody seems to agree it is so important, and yet as important as it is, we don't do nearly a good enough job protecting and promoting it. So abroad, and Admiral Blair, who's here, he's done a lot of work on this. Our IP is stolen all the time by the Chinese. The former head of the NSA called it the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And then in other cases, companies just transfer it. The Chinese say you can sell into our market, but at the cost of you have to give your trade secrets to a Chinese partner. And then at home, we're not investing in basic research at anywhere near the share we have. And when you look at where a lot of the innovations we're talking about today, the internet, GPS, memory foam mattresses, go on down the line, it started in government-funded research labs. So these ideas all together, tax reform, infrastructure, and this innovation idea, all of those sort of speak to things that we think could grow the economy. The bills will be talking a little bit more about once you get the growth in place, how do you make it more equitable?
Okay, the bills. Thank you for your great work. The bills are the co-chairs of the new center project. Bill Galston is co-founder of No Labels and a former domestic policy advisor for President Clinton, currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and weekly columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Bill Kristol is, of course, founder and editor of the Weekly Standard and longtime strategist and thinker in the Republican Party. He previously led the Project for the Republican Future, where he helped shape the strategy that produced the 1994 congressional victory. Two ideas your book focuses on. There are 10 million able-bodied, able-minded people who should be working in this country, and for those working, stagnant wages don't pay for their basic living needs. Can you both separately, I'll start with you, Bill Galston, talk about inclusive growth and what policies can help get us there?
Well, Bill Kay and I've actually divided this up, and I'm the Democrat, so I'm going to be the tough guy on work, and Bill's the Republican, so he's going to be the soft-hearted guy on inclusion and fairness. Seems only right. And our message is really very simple. We want growth that benefits everybody who's willing to contribute to it, as well as those who are too young, too old, or too infirm to do so. That's a basic principle of the new center. And if you ask where does growth come from, well, there are a lot of business people in this room, and I think you know the answer to it. Part of it is productivity, and part of it is a growing workforce actually working more hours. Hours worked times productivity per hour, and there's your economy. So that raises the question, how is the United States doing when it comes to actually putting able-bodied people to work? This is known technically as the labor force participation rate. And the answer in one word is terribly. Just a couple of weeks ago, the World Economic Forum's Global Human Capital report came out, and I eagerly turned to the U.S. page, only to find out when it comes to labor force participation rate, we are now ranked 82nd in the world. Not very good. Then I said to myself, well, maybe that's not fair. What about how are we doing relative to the other advanced industrialized nations? So I went to the recent report of the OECD, 35 countries. We are 30th out of 35th in labor force participation among these advanced countries. I think that ought to be enough to persuade you that there's a problem. And to make matters worse, we're going backwards while other countries are going forwards. We have some of those statistics in the book. Suffice it to say that here's just one example of going backwards. 2 decades ago, we were among the world's leaders in female labor force participation, women in the workforce. We've slipped from 6th to 17th during this period, and such notorious havens of feminism as Japan now have a higher share of women in their paid workforce than we do in the United States. There's a very complicated diagnosis that we go through. Yeah, there's a skills problem. Yes, there's a physical location problem, and those issues can be addressed through public policy. There's also, for men, a reservation wage problem. If you've been working for $25 an hour and then suddenly the best offer you get is $11 at Walmart, a lot of people, a lot of guys are understandably reluctant to take that bargain. It's almost an insult to their dignity. That's part of the problem, but we also have problems with incarceration. 17 million former felons, almost all of them men, who are now outside the prison system. We have problems with drugs. We've all heard about the opioid epidemic, problems with obesity, and problems with poorly conceived public programs such as the SSDI program, the disability program, which is structured so that it locks people into a permanent position of dependence once they enter the program. And for women, you have similar problems, but with one twist, namely women still labor under a special burden of balancing work in the home and work in the paid workforce. And if you compare our policies in that area to those of the rest of the advanced industrialized world, and even countries who aren't so advanced, we are way behind, and we're doing very little to close the gap. So suffice it to say that corresponding to that diagnosis of the problem of inadequate participation in the labor force, we have a series of remedies on both the programmatic side, but I'll conclude on the following note. There's also a moral issue here. We believe that it's time to re-norm work. That is to say, to reestablish the principle that if you can work, you should. Because if you don't, then you're not contributing to the economy and will probably end up as a draw on the labor of others. If you can't work, that's understandable and perfectly acceptable. But if you can, it's not.
I hate the idea of being the soft-hearted, nice guy, and I've managed to avoid that for 30 years in Washington. And
You're kind of
this is what
evolving
it's
now, though,
this is
Bill.
what it's
Good
come
at
to. You know, it's sad. You know, someone say some British politician said every political career ends in failure, and I feel like mine is now. You know, no, I'm honored, of course, to be part of the new center. Don't get me wrong. And actually, I do think it's a new moment and it requires new thinking. I want to actually. Just one footnote, though, before I talk a little bit about the policy stuff. I want to make clear, I mean, I was talking with Tony Blair about this, and it occurred to me that maybe one of us should have made this clear at the beginning. This is a book of policy ideas. This is not a comprehensive answer to the Trump phenomenon or to the Trump and Sanders phenomena, and shouldn't be thought to be, and certainly Bill and I wouldn't want you to think it be. I mean, think it's extremely important, leaving aside whether these policy ideas get implemented or not, whether or not the problem solvers succeed in particular policies or not, to defend liberal democracy, to defend the rule of law, to defend constitutional norms, to defend the liberal international order, period. I mean, so the policies front is related, of course, but is somewhat different. So I don't want to make it seem as if, our answer, the full answer to the problems we face, either in Europe or here or elsewhere, is, some clever public policies that will work better. I think that's really important, but it is also important to step back and make that defense. A lot of us have done this in other contexts, and that wasn't the point of this effort. I do think the two are related in this way. In the real world, however, the strength of liberal democracy and of the liberal world order, for that matter, is related to the success of public policies. I mean, it just is harder. Liberal democracy at home will be more vulnerable to demagoguery if you have financial crises, 1% growth, failures in foreign policy than if you have reasonable successes, and if you have a system that doesn't seem responsive. So this book doesn't address a whole ton of process reforms, congressional reforms, governance reforms that also would be worth that many people have addressed. That certainly No Labels is addressed, and Bill and I and others on this, everyone here probably has over time thought a lot and talked a lot about those things too. So this is not the one solve, the one solution to the problems we face in the country. I do think it's important, though, on the growth issue. The way I would put it is this, very briefly: is I think Democrats like to, attack, or let's see, Bernie Sanders Democrats like to attack Wall Street. Let's say the organized fraud. I think Sanders said Wall Street's simply a system of organized fraud. Wasn't that what he said? I think in the campaign, over and over and over, which is a pretty astonishing thing. I mean, Trump is astonishing, and I yield to no one in my dislike of many things that Trump said. But Sanders, in a way, didn't get quite enough grief, in my opinion, for sort of saying as if tens of millions of Americans are just participating in some fraudulent effort. I mean, that's all that Wall Street is. It's really a sort of shocking thing to say. So the Democrats, on the left at least, want to simply attack various forms of big business. Republicans when asked about some particular problem, want to say, well, it's the market. You can't really do anything about it. Neither of those can really be an acceptable answer, I think, to the real challenges we face. And in particular, on this precise point of inclusive growth, it's just a fact. It doesn't require any malevolence on anyone's part, any ill intention, that the returns to capital over the last 20 years, certainly strikingly since 2009, however, have been wildly better than the returns to labor. If you own stocks, you've had a nice comeback from 2009. If you own property, most places have come back, and a lot of people have done very, very well. If you depend on your wages, you haven't fully come back from 2009, and even you have barely now come back to where you were if you're middle income, lower middle income, to where you were in 2000. So that's just a fact, and it's a problem, and it doesn't answer. Maybe that is, in fact, the market working in a new world where technological growth and technological disruption and globalization has changed the balance of power between capital and labor and advantaged well-educated people more relative to less educated people than used to be the case. But you still have to address that then. I mean, seeing that it's a product of bigger forces beyond our control doesn't mean that one gives up. I think too many Republicans have taken the view that, well, we can't do anything about it, and we're not going to sign on to Bernie Sanders' program, so there's nothing to be done. And we did try in this book to suggest at least the beginnings of ways to be serious about helping working class and middle class families, and especially helping wages, making work pay. And that was Clinton's slogan. But it's really been a bipartisan commitment in America for decades and forever, really. And there's something wrong when when work doesn't pay. It's wrong both in and of itself, and it's also very bad, as we've seen, I think, in the last couple of years, for loyalty to the political and economic system. I mean, there's nothing that we've created an environment inadvertently where demagoguery has become easier and easier, and we're now paying the price for it.
Next, I'm going to go in order of my topics to Jonathan Cantor, who is here, and Franklin for who are going to talk about challenging the titans of technology. Jonathan Cantor is a partner at the antitrust group at the Paul Weiss Law Firm, where he's led a number of cases litigating anti-competitive business practices in America and around the world. He also formerly worked with the Federal Trade Commission. Franklin Foer, staff writer for The Atlantic Magazine and former editor of The New Republic. He's also a fellow with the New America Foundation, and just this week released his new book, World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech, which explores the hidden and not so hidden ways that a few big tech companies are influencing all of our lives. Gentlemen, one of the focuses of the ideas to recenter America is the issue of antitrust, and that in America, historically, the breakup of Standard Oil and the same thing with AT&T were that these changes were made following a wave of consumer pressure. But these companies, these tech companies, are incredibly popular, and most consumers remain unconcerned either about data collection or other issues and the threat to privacy. How were these companies able to concentrate their power and to grow, and what should be done to affect any negative consequences? And I'm going to let Jonathan answer first.
Great. So thank you. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the antitrust laws go back a long way in our country, dealing with bottleneck monopolies, oil companies, railroads, telecommunications, operating systems, mainframe computers. When we look at the tech titans today, they are essentially all of those combined. They are the infrastructure for our new economy. But what we have is these markets that, and you ask the question, is how do they get so big so fast and unchallenged by the antitrust laws? The answer is multifold. One is these are huge bodies or companies that get smarter the more people use them. And the bigger they get, the smarter they get, the harder it is to take them on. And so we get in a situation where once you get that advantage, it becomes very difficult for anyone to claw their way up. And so they lend themselves to monopolies. Second is our antitrust laws really hit a massive decline around the 80s and have continued down that decline through present day. And that's a function of the law and economics revolution. And what happened was, in economics, and sound economics is a good, healthy thing, but it replaced the law. Law enforcement was replaced with essentially a bunch of regulators who decided how their models were going to apply. And if you look at how those models exist in today's world, they don't apply. They don't work well. And antitrust law has taken a back seat. I kid you not, the Federal Trade Commission spends its days now focusing on economic liberty and state licensing practices. And industry licensing practices relating to bull semen and ice skating teachers and piano teachers. That's where they're spending their money in a world where we have these massive tech titans that are displacing workers and creating barriers to entry. So it's a massive, massive problem. Also, we have a world in which the regulators don't understand the technologies. It's amazing. You walk in and they're smart people, but they don't really get how significant and how substantial these technologies are and how important they are as platforms. And that's the last point I'll make now, which is that these aren't just big companies. They're platform technologies. They're platforms for business. Used to be if you wanted to start a business, you'd go down to your local main street, you get a storefront, you hang out your shingle, and boom, you get people to walk by and you sell stuff. Well, today, if you want to have that storefront, if you want to start a business, you need to start that business on the virtual main street, and that's a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon. And they provide that platform. They also compete on that platform, which creates a great self-interest, and it becomes a real barrier. The other thing that happens, we talk a lot about regulation. These have become a series of private regulators, and effectively, they dictate the rules of commerce, the rules of the road, for everyone who participates on that platform. And so they tell you how to run your business, whether you can charge a subscription for your newspaper or whether you have to give it away for free. They want to take 30% of your revenue if you're selling through Amazon or if you want to distribute an app through Apple. This is having a massive effect on our economy. It's having a massive effect on entrepreneurship and small business. And a lot of these companies sustain massive losses for many years. So our antitrust laws just haven't kept up with the times. And it's an insular community that's really captured. And if you talk to folks in the antitrust community, what they'll say, oh, it's not about policy. It's simply a matter of law enforcement. Look at everything in a vacuum. But I don't see how you can divorce antitrust law from our economic policy and from our social policy. The two are intertwined. And we need to rethink how we approach these issues. We need to prioritize away from ice skating teachers, piano teachers, and bull semen industry to focus on the things that affect our daily lives and our economy, and really think about as a matter of policy where we want to focus in terms of the antitrust law.
Okay, Franklin.
So, Prime Minister Blair said that the center should not be a mealy-mouthed splitting of differences, and I think the picking up of this issue really does challenge that assumption about the center. And I want to challenge you all to think about the issue of the big tech companies as an issue for centrist concern. So we have these four big companies: Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. And I think we all have this innate sense of our dependence on these companies, but also the ways in which these companies have designed products pretty intentionally to addict us. I mean, I've sat and I've watched you all in this room, and you've done an admirable job of not checking your cell phones throughout this. And apparently, when it comes to attention, the center truly does hold. We just need to look at ourselves and look at the ways in which we interact with these technologies over the course of our days. And so, of course, addiction is a necessary part of capitalism, and we tolerate it to a certain extent across a lot of industries. But when we're dealing with these companies, we're not dealing just with tobacco, which is bad, or the ways in which food is oftentimes designed to addict people. We're dealing with intellectual matter, we're dealing with news, we're dealing with information, and we're dealing with reality, because these companies stand between us and news. They're creating virtual realities that we're soon going to be inhabiting. And so I think that these companies are magical. They've created incredible things. They're great tributes to capitalism and human ingenuity. But we shouldn't just be seized by the magic of these companies, and we really need to consider their dark side. And I think from a centrist perspective, there's important reasons to consider their dark side. The first is we just need to look at the political environment, and Tony Blair alluded to this, and that is the way in which these companies actually contribute to the polarization of political discourse. And I think Facebook is the textbook example of this. So what Facebook is it's a giant feedback loop. Facebook is designed to give you what you want, or sometimes the things that you didn't even think that you want, because Facebook has amassed this incredible trove of data, and that data is an intimate portrait of your psyche. And so we see this with all the time with politics, and the ways in which we've created these filter bubbles where you have the left and you have the right existing in these hive minds that have been nurtured in effect by Facebook. And so I think if we care about reviving a more diverse, independent, free-thinking political spectrum, we need to think hard about the problems posed by these companies. Second is the question of capitalism. And when you have an economy that is concentrated in the ways that this economy has grown concentrated, it dampens entrepreneurship. If you can't displace these big companies, it diminishes the incentive to create new companies. When you become dependent on these companies, and it diminishes incentives. And then finally, I would just challenge everybody to think about this problem as a moral and spiritual problem as well, which is one thing where the center should also be leading, which is we're merging with machines. We've been merging with machines since we became Homo sapiens. And machines and technology are testaments to humanity. But we're crossing various thresholds where these machines, we now wear them on our arms. Google Glass is something we wear on our nose. They're soon going to be implanted within us. And so we're merging with machines in a very, very new sort of way. And not just merging with the machines, but merging with the companies that operate the machines and have a certain set of values. And so if we're going to change as humans into something different, it's important that we approach this transition in the most thoughtful, clear-headed sort of way. And so I'd just like to thank this organization and thank everybody here for considering these issues, which oftentimes don't get the consideration that they deserve.
Thank you, Franklin. In the center of my panel on centrist policy, Tamar Jacoby is here. She has been writing and thinking about immigration for a long time. She's written several books about it, and today she serves as the CEO of Immigration Works USA, a national federation of small business owners working to advance better immigration law. Tamar, immigration never tires of remaining the most contentious issue in our politics. You talk a lot about the importance of immigration to the economy, and that is a point made in Ideas to Recenter. How can you see, when they've tried so many times and failed, leaders in Washington, a path to a reasonable compromise that's good for the economy and addresses the very authentic and valid fears that people have about border security?
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about the politics. I think that it's hard enough to think of what can be the answer that's a right-left policy answer on immigration. I'm not going to address how they can do it in Washington. But I think Tony Blair was really thoughtful when he said most voters are, if they are appalled by prejudice. I think most are not prejudiced, and if they are, they're appalled by prejudice, and they are not basically anti-immigrant, but they do want rules. They do want control, and they do want rules, and they want a sense that their country is in charge of what's happening. And I think this booklet comes up with some very interesting ideas about how to find that balance in a way that isn't just the squishy center. First is we do probably need more enforcement, particularly in the workplace. And this report is front and center. E-Verify would be a good idea. E-Verify so that employers can check that the people they're hiring are indeed legal. On the other hand, we probably do need some answer for those 11 million people who are here without papers that isn't just ignoring them or pretending they're going to go home. So good, so far good balance. Very important, thoughtful point. Let's add let's recommit to the melting pot. Let's recommit to integration and figure out what that means in the 21st century. But I think in a way the most interesting idea they have, those are all good ideas, I endorse all those ideas. I think in a way the most powerful and interesting idea they have is let's reallocate the percentage of the people who we let in to have it be more about employment and less about family. And the big idea there is more in America's interest, less about the rights of the immigrants. I mean, rights are important. We're not going to abandon rights, but American interests should be coming first. And we ought to think about the workers that we need for our economy and reallocate the share of visas. And there's a set of nifty little charts on the immigration section of the booklet that compares the U.S. to Canada and Australia, similar countries. Canada, 30% roughly of its inflow every year is employment-based. Australia, 60% of its inflow every year is employment-based. I think there's some other countries. I think Germany, it's 80. In the U.S., the actual number is about 7. On the little nifty chart suggests 14, but in fact, half of that 14% are spouses. So only about 7% of the inflow are actually employment-based visas. That's just way out of whack. It's way out of whack in comparison to other countries. It's way out of whack for what should be good to America, would be good for America. There's some caveats to this, though. Let's just not go too simply to it's so easy, let's create a bunch of worker visa programs, right? Because, the first caveat is you don't want to eliminate family. In the U.S., traditionally, it's always been about you sponsor your relatives, and that you can. Somebody tough-minded person on some other part of the stage will say, "Well, that's too squishy. That's too compassionate." In fact, family is the best social safety net we have for immigrants, and a lot of unemployed, less skilled men by themselves is not exactly what we want as an immigration force. So some family is good. We don't want to eliminate it. Number two is, of course, any government program that's going to bring workers to work in the United States, those employers should have to try to hire Americans first, or make some proxy for trying to hire Americans first. The system that we have is not very good, but maybe you pay a fee or you do something. This can't just be nakedly at the expense of American workers, and that's really important. The wages are obviously really important. I mean, the popular understanding of immigration is a lot of myths about the wages. I mean, in fact, there's almost left and right, hawkish and dove immigration economists agree that there's very little wage effect, except for the 9% of the American workforce that doesn't have a high school diploma. So there isn't much of a wage effect, contrary to the popular understanding, and that has to be explained better. But of course, any policy is going to have some kind of wage protection, and look out about that. But in a way, the trickiest and the fourth and most important caveat, in my view, is it's not just enough to bring in a bunch of brainiac, high-skilled immigrants. For our workforce, we do need more PhD scientists. Every country in the world is looking for innovators and scientists and high-level business people and entrepreneurs, and they obviously create jobs in ways that are obvious, new technology and new businesses. But it's also true that we need some less skilled immigrants. And we're seeing that today in massive shortages in construction, agriculture, increasingly now, again, hospitality. The rationale there is that in 1960, half of all the men in the labor force, in the U.S. labor force, were high school dropouts. Today, less than 10% are high school dropouts, and we still need some people to do that kind of work. And the irony is that even those less skilled workers create jobs for Americans. Because if I'm running a little restaurant group and I want to open, my 8th restaurant, and I can't find the people to wash the dishes, I can't open the restaurant and hire the architect and the chef and the waiters and the other businesses in town that are going to feed into my restaurant. If I can find those busboys, I can open the 8th restaurant. So even low-skilled immigrants grow the pie. We should move toward a more employment-based immigration system, but it shouldn't just be a brainiac point system.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear from John Deary on new and small business. A few years ago, John wrote a book called Where the Jobs Are, in which he traveled the country talking to entrepreneurs about their most important concerns and priorities. This led him to launch the Center for American Entrepreneurship. John also previously served as the acting CEO of the Financial Services Forum. John, new businesses account for all net new job creation in the United States, but rates of entrepreneurship are now at an historic low. What led to this decline, and what can be done to reverse it?
Thank you for having me. Before I get to the what can be done part, I just want to underscore the extent to which the problem is happening. And lots of very smart folks have been thinking about this for a long time. I'd just like to call attention to, I think, one of the most alarming pieces of research that was done by two former colleagues of Bill Galston's, Bob Lighton and Ian Hathaway, who published the paper out of the Brookings Institution in 2014, in which they pointed out their research concluded that not only has there been a 3-decade decline in rates of entrepreneurship nationally or in aggregate, but that this decline is happening in all 50 states. It's happening in all but a handful of 360 metro areas that they examined, and it's happening across a broad range of industry sectors, including high tech. So this is a stark decline. It's been going on for 3 decades, long-term secular decline, and it's pervasive. And so the question is, should we care? Is this as the new center's idea booklet said, called it a big deal? And I think it is. I think it is for two principal reasons. One is, as you just pointed out, AB, research done in recent years has made clear that virtually all net new job creation in the U.S. economy is accounted for by new businesses. Another way of saying that is that were it not for new businesses, the job base in this country would shrink each year. As a matter of fact, the research showed that if you look at businesses older than 5 years old in aggregate, regardless of the industry sector or how big or how old they are, businesses older than 5 years old in aggregate shed about 1 million jobs a year as they get better at what they do, as they incorporate capital, as they get more efficient, meaning that were it not for new businesses, the job space would shrink. Net new job creation is important. It's always been important. It's going to be more important going forward as things like automation, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, all the things that you all were talking about, as those technologies begin to be applied increasingly in the U.S. economy with all kinds of implications for job creation and job opportunity, we're going to need as much net new job creation as we can get. More fundamentally, or more importantly, I think, to the context of this conversation, is that we also know that new businesses account disproportionately for innovation, especially big innovation, or what's commonly referred to as disruptive innovation. If you think back over the last 150 years, the major innovations that have defined the economic landscape, everything from the railroads, the cotton gin, the steam engine, electrification, the telegraph and telephone, the automobile, the airplane, my personal favorites, air conditioning and refrigeration, all the way up, computers, countless applications of the internet, all the way up through and including wireless communication. All of these big innovations and many more came from startups. The reason is that existing firms, they do innovate, but it tends to be at the margin. They're not particularly well positioned or even that particularly interested in disruptive innovation because they're the establishment. So think about what Steve Jobs did to IBM and Hewlett-Packard in the 80s. Think about what Jeff Bezos has done to retail with Amazon. Think about what Elon Musk is doing to the automotive and industries now, where Uber and Lyft are doing to on-call transportation. These are the transformative kinds of innovation that drive the economy forward. Why is that important? Well, as Bill Galston alluded to a little while ago, where does economic growth come from? It comes from growth in the labor supply, for sure. That's why topics like the labor force participation rate are important. That's why immigration is important. But we learned from the great work of Robert Solow that the principal driving force of economic growth is gains in productivity, driven by innovation, which, as I just said, comes disproportionately from startups. If that's true, then the fact that the U.S. economy has not grown at 3% or better, our historical average rate of growth is about 3.4%, the U.S. economy has not grown at 3% or better since 2005. Since the end of the Great Recession, so over the course of the last 8 years, we've grown at about 2.2%. If economic growth comes from gains in productivity, which comes from innovation, which comes disproportionately from startups, and startups are at a 30-year low, then I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to get back to the kinds of growth rates we need that, as Ryan said, will make our problems either go away or make them a lot more easy to deal with unless we turn that 30-year decline in entrepreneurship around. The question is, how do you do it? To answer that question, you have to have an idea as to why it's happening. And that's the exercise that AB alluded to. When I found out all this, I wanted to know, why in the world is this happening? A lot of smart folks have been thinking about it for years. How could I possibly come up with something that is new and insightful about this? Well, I and a colleague decided to take a crack at it a few years ago, and what we decided to do, or it occurred to us, that if you want to know what's going on with American entrepreneurs, one way to figure that out would be to get out of Washington, D.C., travel the country, and ask them. So that's what we did. We conducted roundtables with entrepreneurs in 12 cities across the United States. Cities as diverse as, or startup scenes as diverse as Cambridge, Massachusetts, Kansas City, Missouri, Columbus, Ohio, Orlando, Florida, L.A., Seattle. And we asked them quite simply, what's in your way? And what they told us was quite astonishing. We expected that we would hear different things at different roundtables. It's a very big country, very diverse economy, very different startup scenes. And we started hearing the same half a dozen or so major themes everywhere we went. And they track with what is talked about in the New Center's book, in no particular order. We have the jobs. We need to fill them in order to grow and survive. We cannot find enough folks with the skills that we need. That's a domestic issue. That's an indictment of the American education system issue. And we heard everywhere we went, the American education system has got to be a lot more like Germany's. Kids have got to be, academic studies have got to be paired with apprenticeships and work studies so that kids graduate with day one skills. That problem is further exacerbated by insane immigration policies, especially high-skilled immigration. We can't find enough domestic kids with the skills that we need. We can't augment that gap with foreign-born folks. Access to capital issues, always a problem for entrepreneurs. In the wake of the financial crisis, more acute than ever. Regulatory burden, uncertainty, and complexity. Tax burden, uncertainty, and complexity. So in order to get back to the kind of economic circumstances we need to build that consensus for a political center, we've got to get back to 3% growth, or growth that's north of 3%. And it seems clear that in order to get there, the pathway back is a revitalization of American entrepreneurship. So I was very pleased when I heard about the creation of the center to see that, that entrepreneurship is squarely on the agenda. And we at the Center for American Entrepreneurship look forward to participating in that. So thank you.
Thank you, John. We would like to welcome your questions for any of the panelists now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a little disconnect for me about the entrepreneurship. I heard that 60% of the millennials want to be entrepreneurs, want to own their own business. We see that more and more. Where is the disconnect from that? We see this tremendous yearning for young people don't want to work for large companies like myself. So what's happening?
Well, in fact, rates of that may be true in terms of their desires. You know, like I'd love to start my own business. I'd love to work for a startup. In fact, research by the Kauffman Foundation and others have shown that rates of entrepreneurship among millennials are at historic lows. And in fact, the age group that is accounting for most startups now, if I've got this essentially right, it's essentially middle age, is 35 to 54, believe it or not. That's a problem. And it's a very complex question as to why is it that our young folks, our millennials, aren't doing this? Why are they risk averse? Does it have something to do with the fact that they came of age during the financial crisis? Does it have something to do with the fact that they're graduating $100,000 in debt, would love to go to a startup but can't, so they go somewhere else because they have to service their debt? It's a very complex question, but it's at the heart of this broader problem of declining rates of entrepreneurship.
You're my next question.
Hi, Bob Hormetz. I'd like to go back to the question of trade. One of my worries is that bipartisanship isn't always good. And one of the things that worries me is that bipartisanship on trade could turn out to be an easy way for the two parties to get together on a set of policies that could be very harmful to the country. And I think that that focuses, at least my attention, on what the problem is. Clearly, trade is not as disruptive to jobs as technology, and that was discussed earlier. But it is to certain communities. And I think their big gripe is not so much the magnitude, but it goes back to a Tony Blair point that he made earlier about immigration. The general view on immigration is people don't think there are rules, they don't think there are procedures that are followed, and it's an open season on immigration. On trade, I think a lot of Americans are not protectionist. Mark Penn's work has always underscored that. I think the problem is that they don't perceive the rules are either fair or the rules are being enforced. And in fact, they're right on both counts. The free traders have done a terrible job of, and I consider myself one of them, a terrible job of really advocating the benefits of free trade and not giving enough emphasis to the need for a much more assertive enforcement of rules. And I think in particular this talks about China, but it's not just China, it's others, other countries as well, and other issues as well. Many rules are not covered by the WTO. Many of them are not really covered by American law in a very effective way. So I believe that unless we're able to develop a very explicit set of rules internationally and domestically, and a much clearer understanding by Americans that the rules are good and are being enforced, we're going to be faced with a growing set of pressures for protectionism, which will adversely affect the economy and adversely affect foreign policy.
Bob,
You've been a thoughtful contributor to the national discussion on trade for decades now, and I'd be quite foolish and reckless to argue with you. So what I'll simply do is to say that what we did in this booklet was to focus particularly on a problem that we think is a big problem, that not just China in general, and we do not subscribe to the view that the trade deficit, bilateral or multilateral, is the right measure. We were particularly troubled to learn about the ways in which China is using its market power to require and enforce technology transfer from our firms who want to do business in China to majority Chinese control. Those are the crown jewels of our economy. And we argue very strongly that we need institutions and rules to retard and, if possible, prevent forced technology transfer, because otherwise we're going to lose the game. And and I don't think that that is simply a race to the bottom of the sentiments of both political parties. I think it's the identification of a real problem that the American Chamber of Commerce in China is talking about more and more with each passing year, and where the statistics are, I think, absolutely overwhelmingly decisive. So that's what we're focused on, and not crude trade measures.
If I could just add one word, I mean, the centrist policies don't mean splitting the difference in every case. They also require disaggregating things. And there are times when I personally would say liberals or conservatives are just right on something, and one has to make the case that they're right. I think on trade in particular, for me, NAFTA and China are totally different topics. And Trump, in my view, has done a lot of damage to the country by demagoguing NAFTA, a lot of damage to our foreign policy, and continues to do so. And I see no reason to be particularly personally accommodating to that and, say, oh, yes, we should work it all out. I think we should begin by saying he's demagogued an issue which there was actually, if I might say, a center on 20 years ago, which Bill Clinton, to his credit, has supported, and Republicans, to their credit, passed in Congress without Democratic majorities, as I recall, in Congress. And it's been good for the hemisphere. It's been very good for Mexico. It's very much in our national interest to have a Mexico that's stronger and wealthier rather than weaker and in chaos. And I'm not really interested in sort of splitting the difference on that. China, I think, is a whole different story. I'm not against, well, I was at the time, but I'm not against anymore having let them into the WTO. We've gone way past that bridge. But really thinking seriously about a state-controlled economy of that size and so forth is a different thing. So disaggregating in some of these areas is very important. But it's also important to make the moral case on trade in particular. People have been much too defensive. I agree with you on this. The free trade regime that the U.S. has been the center for 70 years has brought huge benefits to the world. One of the great moral achievements of the last half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st is taking hundreds of millions of people, billions I suppose, out of really abject poverty, into giving them a decent chance at life. And most of them are in China and India. And it wouldn't have happened without the American-led international liberal order, which is partly a defense thing and foreign policy thing, and partly a trade and economic growth thing. And people shouldn't be too defensive. I mean, yes, there are side effects and jobs get lost in certain places, and we probably should be better at adjusting for that and figuring out intelligent policies. We discussed this briefly in the book about how to help displaced workers and so forth. But I agree that in some issues, in other words, even if people are unhappy, at some point one also has to say good policy is good policy. And I think on trade in particular, there's been much too much, in my opinion, almost bowing to the political winds instead of, in some cases, saying, well, wait a second. It is really not a good idea when South Korea is an important ally and you want to send a signal of strength in Asia to say in the middle of a North Korea crisis, let's renegotiate the South Korea trade accord. I don't think that's like a 50-50, let's split the difference proposition. That's just foolish. And it would be good if people said so.
Chuck Lane, do you have a microphone?
Thank you. And this question puts together what Mark Penn said with what we've been hearing in this panel, because I'm at least struck by a contrast, which I'd like anyone who wants to comment on. He said that 60% or more of the people now say they are living the American dream. And they're as satisfied with the economy as I've seen since 1996. And yet, it seems like you have all kinds of great ideas for rebuilding the center, which are essentially about, seemingly have the opposite premise. And that contrast struck me, and I'd just like to hear a comment on that.
Well, this is a moving target, and 8 years after the nadir of the Great Recession, incomes have finally recovered not only to where they were in December of 2007, but roughly speaking where they were in 1999. So people are feeling better than they were 8 years ago. There's no question about that. On the other hand, I have both read and participated in survey research that has asked people, well, what do you think about your children's prospects? And there you get much gloomier answers. Why might we get much gloomier answers? Answer, people are viscerally aware of research that's been done by scholars like Raj Chetty and Rob Shapiro, who's with us in this room, documenting that the old expectation that children were very likely to do better than their parents has turned into at best a 50-50 proposition. And for many cohorts, the trajectory over the past 15 or 20 years has been down. So there is, I think, a deep concern about the future of the American dream, which is compatible with the proposition that right now the present of the American dream is looking brighter than it did 8 years ago. So that's the way I think these are two sides of a pretty complicated, carefully minted coin.
And one just brief footnote, I mean, economists talk, I think, about revealed preferences. The most recent revealed preference of the American electorate was in the 2016 primaries, when 45% of Democrats voted for Bernie Sanders and 45% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump, both of whom, to say the least, ran on the proposition that we are going in the wrong direction. I mean, to their credit, in a way, they didn't pull many punches about that. They were certainly outside the establishments of both parties. So that's the biggest number in both parties in 1 year of a truly voting for outside the mainstream. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean, maybe they're right to be outside the mainstream, but anti-establishment, let's put it that way, candidates in both parties at the same time. I think it's pretty hard to say that a country in which 45% of the voters in the primaries vote for either Sanders or Trump are sort of reasonably satisfied with the kinds of mainstream solutions the political system has been giving them. Partly that's a dysfunction of the political system question. Partly that's maybe not being imaginative enough on the policy side question. And maybe it's also just a fluky thing that Hillary Clinton wasn't a good candidate and the Republicans were split and all that. But still, that's a pretty big data point, I would say. And maybe it'll kind of go away on its own, but I think it's safer to try to improve the policies and make it less easy for the kinds of, in my view, not responsible solutions that were on offer, to make it less easy for them to get that much support.
We are running out of time, but permitting these final two questions. First, you, sir, in your row, and then you have a questioner behind you. We'll go right after. Everyone be as concise as possible. Thank you.
Reform of the parties themselves, so you can have better candidates. I mean, to me, on both sides, governors, for example, who have shown themselves capable of actually dealing with problem solving, don't seem to get a fair shake within the parties. And a lot could, maybe it's the Russians that sabotaged the Democrats, but the Democrats seem to have sabotaged themselves in a very big way, by snuffing out other candidates. And both parties have a lock on the political process, which seems to really not embrace competence and capability.
Who wants to take that?
Can I just say, I mean, on the Republican side, look, maybe, but I mean, the Republican governor of Ohio, who had been elected and reelected by huge majorities, the Republican governor of Texas, who had presided over a pretty amazing economic performance for that state for over 12 years, the former Republican governor of Florida, who had also been a very good governor, I think, for 8 years, the Republican governor of Wisconsin, who for conservatives especially was an amazing success story in a purple state, they all ran. I mean, the system didn't stop them from running, they just happened to lose.
Yeah, the Republican side, but what about the Democrats?
Well, that's, yeah.
Well,
you need to have a few more governors to start with.
From your lips to God's ears, Bill. But just very briefly, I think if you step back and look at the historical record on governors, it's at the presidential level. It's not so terrible. Jimmy Carter was a governor. Ronald Reagan was a two-term governor. George H.W. Bush wasn't, but Bill Clinton, 8 years, a governor. George W. Bush, 8 years, a governor. So I think we'd have to say that over the past 40 or 15 years, we've had our share of governors.
I'd like to go back to the economic point. I think we have in our country had a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the net effects of things like globalism, the post-World War II order, how it affected established industries in the United States, some of which have been deindustrialized over a period of years, how capital has gone to foreign countries for a variety of reasons, and capital will flow where we'll be well treated. And I understand that, and I think it makes sense. I think we have had some problems in in the antitrust sector. People don't fully appreciate the power of the platforms as it was discussed. But I think the real thing that's missing in our country, these changes all in have been incredibly fundamental. Unlike anything we maybe ever have seen in our country. It's complex, and I don't think we've brought together the institutional, technical, and other resources to really think about it at a very high level, a very deep level, in light of what's going on in Silicon Valley and in Washington and elsewhere. In the Depression, we had something called the Temporary National Economic Commission that studied our economy across all sectors to figure out why, what happened, how to fix it. We need something on that order to deal with what's going on with the global economy. Study, not necessarily say these are all the policies.
Either of you?
Well, just very briefly, if the proposition is that we are going through, a wrenching and fundamental economic transformation, I think almost everybody would agree with you. If you're saying further that we haven't really thought through adequately the dimensions of this transformation, its causes and its consequences, I agree with you there as well. If you're saying that our government hasn't gotten its arms around it, who could disagree with that? And I think that whether it's a commission or the collective talents of people in a room like this, seized of the problems that are really shaping our country and driving our future one way or another, we have to raise our game and do better. And I think everybody would agree with that. And with that,
Well, I was just saying the great thing about America is you don't need government to set up commissions for commissions to be set up, and many of the most important ones in American history have come out of think tanks in the private sector and individuals who got together and did certain things. So I think that's a huge strength we have. It's not France where if Paris doesn't decide that something should be studied, it doesn't get studied. So we're sitting in a place that's done a huge amount in this respect without necessarily having government blessing or certainly not being funded by the government. So I do think this is a case where civic, you're talking with stuff people here have been talking about, the private sector, the civil society can do a huge amount.
like this.
Yeah.
I have a great responsibility, which is to get you to your breakout sessions. I would like you to look at the back of your badge to see a letter. If it is A through C, you're going this way. And if it is D or E, you're going that way. And thank you, panel.
Which way is it?